One authoritative person who defines sin, I think, the clearest is the Apostle John. Think he's a pretty good authority? I'll take his word for it. I'm going to quote him. I'm even going to quote him using the King James Version, since it's not only well accepted, but it also eliminates the dynamic translation that the complete Jewish Bible prefers to use. He says in 1 John 3:4, "Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is transgression of the law." Pretty plain? Sin is transgression of the law of Moses. Now that is the direct biblical New Testament definition of sin as pronounced by the Apostle John. Sin is not whatever we choose to make it. Neither the church nor a single believer can unilaterally decide that there is no longer a universal standard for sin, or that every individual carries his or her own truth, and thus is required to obey only their own private set of divine rules. Those who adhere to this erroneous doctrine then accuse those who obey any written biblical law of committing something called legalism. But John says that when you or I violate one of the commandments of the law of Moses, that is precisely what sin is. True, Christ has paid the price for our sin. But just as Paul has already covered a couple of times now, does that mean we just go right on sinning, right on breaking the law? Because there's just plenty of grace available so that we don't pay the consequences of our sinning. What did Paul say to that? Heaven forbid. I mean, wake up, believers. Truly. I mean, our ambivalence, our long slumber is over. Just as before you first believed, the moment you heard the gospel of Christ, I'm sorry, but any excuse you may have had before God to plead ignorance and thus obtain mercy because of it, that evaporated. You have now been taught. You've been shown it in the Holy Scriptures that even the direct words of the Savior himself in Matthew 5 says that the law is anything but dead and gone. And he fully expects all of his followers to obey it. There is no more excuse. You know. Sin has a standard. The standard is the law of Moses. And it is not a denominational decision. It's not our personal standard that God uses. It's not the standard that any particular denomination decides upon. Doesn't matter. And just as Christ pointed out, while it is not obedience to the law, but rather our trust in his faithfulness that brings us acquittal before the Father, even so, our level of obedience to the law of Moses is going to be the determining factor for the status we will hold for an eternity in the kingdom of heaven. You want to live in eternity as the least before God, so be it. If you want to live in eternity as the least before God, that's up to you. But you know, if you want to be more than that, here's what you have to do. Obey him. If you keep on denying the ongoing validity of the law and keep on sinning as a result, it's deliberate because you know better. You have made the decision in your free will to be disobedient. It's conscious. It's intentional. You have decided to follow your comfortable ways, not God's ways, because you like your ways more than God's ways. You see them as far easier, maybe even superior to God's ways. The Bible has a label for that sort of attitude. It's called rebellion. And men, when you lead your family that way, you take on further responsibility.